Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. We haven't had a webinar for a little while, so it's quite nice to be doing these again, and welcome everybody to the session. Feel a little bit rusty because it's been so long, but great to see that so many of you have joined us this afternoon. Just to go through some housekeeping, first of all, just to say that we always find that you'll have the best experience if you use Google Chrome, and if you have any technical difficulties, generally, if you press the refresh button, then that usually resolves the problem for you. And also, we would encourage you to use the chat function. Two ways, really. One, to introduce yourselves to us and to each other, and to engage in kind of conversation if there are things that you hear or want to converse with anybody else about during the session. Please use that function. It is a network event, and we'd encourage that, and say where you are, where you're from, etc. That would be helpful. Use the chat function as well to ask any questions that you might have, and we'll pick the questions up as we go through, and kind of towards the end of the session we're going to redirect those to our panel members. And hopefully, we'll have a good session and you'll get a lot out of it. Just to say as well, it's great that we've got several new, we've got new members now, and we've got new supporters coming on board all of the time. So just a shout out to those people to say welcome. It's great to have you with us. And also just to congratulate again all of the winners and the notably commended who attended our awards event recently. We've had good feedback from that. So obviously, great to see that was successful, and we can start our planning for next year's awards. Okay, so today we are going to be concentrating on the new age of recruitment. So we have got a fantastic panel lined up again today. We've got Doug Rode, who's the Managing Director at Michael Page Group. We've got John Hannen, who's CEO at GMCVO. And we've got Hayfa Mohdzaini, who's a Senior Research Advisor at CIPD. So great expertise joining us today. Just to put the session in a bit of context, just wanted to give a kind of a brief outline, really, just to say that obviously throughout the pandemic, our virtual ways of working, it's actually placed a lot of barriers on the way that we communicate with each other. And it's also had an impact on the way that we carry out some of our kind of day-to-day business, and that does include recruitment. So today we're going to try and look at, what does the new age of recruitment practice look like, hence the fantastic panel that we've got to help and advise us on this topic. We know that recruitment is a central part of your function, and it helps you to get the best people and to create a productive and a fair workforce as well. But we are noticing that more and more employers are looking at, how they can improve the recruitment processes. Many looking at new technologies now that include things like artificial intelligence and algorithms, and I'm sure there's a whole plethora of other things out there as well. But it is an area that's moving quite quickly, and it's quite interesting to see that people are using these machine technologies to help them to shortlist candidates, but also to take out quite a lot of the manual kind of intense labour that might be involved in the recruitment process as well. So it's great. We've got a great panel here. We'll ask some questions initially to each of our panel members, which will hopefully stimulate some discussion and some questions from yourselves. So I'm going to start off first of all with you, Hayfa, and just to ask you kind of what kind of trends have you seen within recruitment over the past couple of years, especially throughout the pandemic?
Hi. So one thing I've seen is the use of AI to help filter candidates, especially, for example, with the huge influx of applications coming in and needing to process in such a short period of time, especially, for example, in supermarkets, having to process so many applications when other stores are closed. One company found it really helpful to use AI to help shortlist the candidates and also rank them. So it cuts out a lot of the work for line managers. But at the same time, the way they used it, I thought was particularly interesting, because what they did was, it wasn't just something that benefited them. They also took the opportunity to provide feedback to candidates as well. So they used AI to provide feedback to candidates on how they could improve their answers next time.
Brilliant. That's good. Okay. Doug, just coming to you as well. Obviously, this is kind of your bread and butter, all of this area of work. Can you just explain a little bit about how AI is used in recruitment, and is it simple for employers to be able to adapt to use it?
There's a good question. Thank you, Carol, and hello, everyone. I get, when you look at the whole world of recruitment technology, as you alluded to, it's changing massively, and it's changing quickly, and it's growing. Look, I think it's predicted to be a £35 billion industry by 2028. So the growth is huge, and therefore there are lots of products that keep coming onto the market the whole time, and stuff improves. Like everything, it's only as good as the data that you're working with. I think whenever you're looking at anything to do with AI, that's what it's built on. I think if I was selling recruitment technology, which I don't, I'd be pitching that you can use it to increase diversity, reduce bias, and increase speed. You know, ultimately, that's what you're looking to try and achieve. I think it has its value, therefore, within some of those things, but it's probably not a panacea for any of them. And certainly, I guess our line certainly around when we talk about AI, we certainly look at it around this augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. We look at it as, look, it's got to be a blend between how that can help you in those three objectives around diversity, bias, and speed, but perhaps not replace it. And I think that's the way I'd encourage everybody to have a look at it. It certainly has a place, and probably a growing one, but it probably needs to be used with a level of knowledge and caution.
Yeah. Do you think, Doug, as well, that it's actually changing the way in which recruiters work as well?
I think it is, but almost in a different way around how they might be using the tools. So if you come back to the efficiency bit as well, I guess a lot of the products out there are around automation rather than probably adding a great deal of intelligence to it. I think when you look at automation, you're looking for predictable, repeatable processes. That's what you'd automate, whether that's in business services or support, back office functions. And it's the same with recruitment. And therefore, it's changing the role of a recruiter within a recruitment consultancy by looking at how do you become more efficient and what can you therefore automate. But a lot of that is to do probably with the administration as opposed to necessarily the selection or the other piece on it as well. I think the bit we've really got to remember is this piece about recruitment, around changing jobs, it's an emotional thing that requires human interaction. And therefore, from a recruiter's point of view, if we can spend more time with human interaction with either our customers or people looking for a role, that's a good thing. And therefore, if we can automate some of these things and add some artificial intelligence to the decision making, to increase diversity, to reduce bias, and to do all those good things, then of course, let's embrace it. But we've just got to get the blend right.
Brilliant. And John, from your perspective, we know that you've kind of talked before about algorithms, etc. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what you know about them?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work supporting people distant from the labour market into the labour market. So with young people who are distant from work, not in employment, education, training, carers, people returning from care, and people over 50 with care responsibilities. And we've seen some biases in some of the algorithms that are used. And I think Doug's right on the money. You can reduce bias if you use them appropriately. And thinking about augmenting and automating, but artificial intelligence doesn't exist. We need to kind of stop saying artificial intelligence. And that idea of augmentation and automation are very important. So just to give you an example, some systems were just kind of filtering out people perhaps with a gap in their employment record. Now, if you've been a carer for a time, you then get hidden to that system. And it's especially at the moment, we've had an environment where there's been too many applicants. And Hayfa talking about supermarkets try to filter down. We're now in a labour market where there's not enough applicants and not enough workers. The latest unemployment stats from Tameside show unemployment at 2.6%. We're getting close to full employment at that point, and you're actually looking for how you can poach people off other employers rather than the fact there's a big pool of unemployed people to go for. And a lot of the kind of employment systems have been done on the basis that there are too many applicants, so how do you funnel them down and filter them? I think the key thing to think about is two processes. One is how do you source applicants, and then is how do you kind of assess and filter that down. And I think you've got a lot of control as well, in terms of if you're thinking about how you source applicants, you've got to pay a lot of attention to the wording you use on adverts, because if you don't do that, then the algorithm will amplify the mistakes you make. So if you create a set of words that appeal to men more than women, or to older workers rather than younger workers, then the algorithm's going to be trained to, oh, this kind of group are not responding to your advert, and so we will not put that in front of that group, that group of people in future. So you've got to recognize that the kind of input that you make into these systems, if you're not mindful and take care about it, you are going to create a bias in that system. And for kind of sourcing applicants, it's making sure you've got multiple routes of entry into your recruitment system as well. Yeah. The interesting thing then becomes on the filtering bit. And I think it was just really interesting. I have to talk about the feedback to candidates. It's just recognizing that recruitment's a social process. And think about the applicant journey. And if you're going to, if you make people feel that they've just been put on a conveyor belt and assessed and discarded, they're not going to think well about your organization, especially when they've got choices. So it's just thinking about, these are powerful tools that can automate massive amounts of calculations very, very quickly and save you labor and so on. But the instructions you give, the way you filter it, is going to have a massive impact on the experience for people going through the process and who gets hidden to you. And I think it's thinking about who you might be missing through your recruitment that then becomes really, really important in how you use it.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting things that you've said there as well, John, because I think there is a feel that it's good because it does speed up the process, etc. But you're right, you do still have to think about the wording. And as you were talking about some of the challenges then, I almost felt like you'd read some of the membership criteria for the Good Employment Charter, because they're all of the things that we ask our employers to do, is think about the wording and, to make sure that you can attract as wide a candidate pool as possible. Just to go back to you as well, Hayfa, obviously, kind of some of these approaches can be quite scary for some employers to think about, kind of change. It's another change that's happening. Have you come across with the employers that you work with that kind of more acceptance or some skepticism around these new technologies? Are they really embracing them, or is there some nervousness as well? Were you on mute, Hayfa?
Sorry, I think it's a range of them. So there are people who are skeptical, as well as those who are embracing it and trying the more experimental things like I mentioned to you in the first example. So yes, it's a mixed bag. On the issue of bias, it really, I think that what it comes down to, it's assessing how the systems are designed. It's quite difficult because vendors don't always explain how they do the analysis and come up with it. So I guess as savvy consumers, we do need to query and not give up and say, can you explain how you get to this point? So we always, it's our money, so we have to always query what we're buying, in just the same as you would when you buy a car. You always find out more before you actually buy. So that's probably my advice.
Great, lovely. And Doug, just thinking about the kind of the people that you're working with as well, are you finding that there is, when you're asked about kind of roles, etc., are you finding that people are being driven more by wanting to be more inclusive as opposed to kind of cutting down the time it takes, etc.? Is there more awareness about EDI, etc., or is it a bit of both, really?
I think there's I think that there's a bit of both. I think there's a absolutely a growing awareness around the whole ESG agenda, which is great to see. And I think there are different levels of depending on organization as to whether they're serious about that or whether they've been told to be including that. But I think you do tend to find it's very much there for people, and it's important. I think back to John's point too. Not across the board, but in lots of roles, there's a candidate shortage, and therefore, if you're fishing in exactly the same pools as you always fish for, if you're looking for somebody who's just done the job before, you're going to struggle. I think the other thing is when you look at the other end of the spectrum and go, look, roles are changing, organizations are changing to adapt to a future world. and therefore finding somebody who's necessarily done exactly the same job before is going to be a bit tricky. And therefore there can be some real value around this, about looking across a more diverse pool of candidates, trying to work out actually what are the competencies that I'm looking for, what are the key traits that I'm after, and how can I perhaps identify that across a broader section of the population to achieve the goal of filling my role and moving my organization forward. So they are conversations that are happening an awful lot more. We tend to find typically either conversations around recruitment automation and or depth of conversations around the D&I and ESG agenda tend to be more frequent with larger organizations than they do with smaller ones. Which is probably to be expected, but certainly we're finding lots of the smaller organisations that we're talking to, they're quite keen to get our input and to understand a little bit more about it, because they know they're things that they need to action moving forwards.
Yeah. And John, thinking about some of the organisations that you work with, what kind of things could be put in place to encourage them to think about these new methods as well, to support them? Because as Doug's alluded to, there have been the larger organisations predominantly getting involved, but obviously the smaller organisations would benefit from this as well, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and I think it's recognising that if you outsource anything, then there's a gain for that, but there's also a trade-off. You lose control. I think getting into that point of basically saying, well, start slowly and grow your engagement with it. Start just with sourcing candidates rather than try to do the assessment of candidates straight away. If you've then got this ability to use different routes of entry for people to apply as well, then you're not just exposing yourself to what. So I use algorithmic systems in terms of recruitment because we need as many candidates as possible, but we'll stick stuff on our own website. We'll use networks as well. We use the job center, but we'll use some of the big commercial operators just to get a pile of CVs in that we can then go through. And I'd rather have some applicants than none at the moment, which is what we've seen. So I think it's start by trying to increase the diversity in the range and just sheer number of candidates and get used to it and see. And then you've got that ability to compare with, is there other people missing from the candidate pool that you're getting in that you would expect to see there? And at least you've got some information about that. So I think there's easy ways to get involved using those recruitments, but it's don't put all your eggs in one basket. These things are cliches for a reason, because sometimes they're true. So it's start by using them, see how they go, and recognize what you might be losing on the way as you start to develop it. You don't have to go the whole way through and lose control completely. Yeah.
And just a general question to all of you. Are you finding that there are any kind of pockets where people are being missed? Are there any trends yet being identified of where people are being missed that you would hope would be captured through these methods? And if you've got any thoughts.
I'll happily jump in. It's a hard one, isn't it? Because you don't know what you don't know. I think you probably learn that more as you experiment more, to try different channels to then work out and go, wow, we never thought about that. I kind of give you a real live example of us recruiting for ourselves, where we're looking at a number of different applications where we can go, okay, where can we go to different parts of the market to try and generate some applications, and then view how successful those applicants are going to be within an organization. We'll then be pinching ourselves and going, why didn't we start to bring people in from that background 5 years ago? I think we're going to learn as we go, but it's people are out there, and you've got to hope this technology will help you find them, but it's hard to know what you don't know.
Yeah. Go on, John.
Yeah, and I think something we found is by being a bit clearer on the kind of employee value proposition and being clear about what the benefits are to working for us, and changing the way we create ads as well, just to attract people. I think we tend to see that we're talking about digital approaches, so you actually start thinking about which people are the least comfortable with some of those approaches, or less aware of where to go to. People might have high levels of digital skills, but not have the understanding of all the kind of places. So it's people, older workers, some from minority ethnic communities, and some of those kind of barriers that are there, who can do a good job and just may not be familiar with some of the systems, but still have high levels of skills. And certainly, I think if you start looking at the growth of unemployment at the moment and who's losing jobs and not getting into work, then there's clearly an issue with people over 50 who are struggling to find employment at the moment. And so if there's more use of these systems and people over 50 are not getting into work, then I'm going to guess there's a barrier there that we need to think about. And so that's the kind of first thing that comes to mind. But I think also recognizing about what the pandemic has done to people's care responsibilities as well. We've certainly seen by being very clear that we want to be a carer-friendly employer, that we've increased our applicants. So but these are kind of just good employment practices. It's just how you then present them in ads. So that one of the first things, a lot of people have been dismayed by experiences of work or feel that work isn't for them or employers aren't for them, and just getting that offer to the employee up front before you start thinking about the kind of person you want can be quite useful as well, and just recognizing some of those barriers that people might have and challenges they might be facing. Yeah.
So if somebody is looking at this now, and we've had a question through the panel about kind of which tools businesses are using the most, or any recommendations, and Hayfa has replied, and obviously in her role she has to be neutral and be impartial, but are there any kind of recommendations that Doug or John you could make in terms of, you know, what somebody that's kind of coming to this new could look at to start to embrace some of these technologies? Are there any systems, products out there, recommendations that you would make as a starting point?
I think there are plenty. I think it's probably hard for me to make a recommendation. I'd plead the fifth like Hayfa probably with regards to that. But I think, going back to what John was saying, I think you've got to be pretty clear about what it is that you want to do. I think I'd do a fair amount of research first before you go shopping to understand actually what's possible. And then, you know, there are no products out there that do everything across the particular suite. And I think if I come back to an earlier point, we are to look, a lot of this stuff works on data, and therefore if you're buying something in, if you're a small organization, you don't have your own data, you're then relying on some other people's data to make decisions for your organization. You need to be really, really clear that that's a good basis that you're working on and something that you're comfortable with. So I think rather than a product recommendation, there are some good things out there, but I think you need to be really specific about what it is that you want to do. Start off with the basics and look at how you perhaps build from there. Don't go and believe you can buy a product that's going to automate your recruitment process off the shelf tomorrow, because that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen, no.
Can I just add something to that, to what Doug's just said? So it's really, really broad recruitment, because what are you talking at the point of sourcing, and the example I gave was selection, and then after that you have the sort of vetting the background and so on. So it's a really broad range, and like Doug said, it depends on what your organization needs. And there's free tools out there, and there's things that you pay, and there's things that already exist in the systems that you've got. So like HRIS or HR systems would have some elements of recruitment, like a recruitment module in there, which does some level of automation where, you know, it has the applicant tracking system, you know, for what point are they at the application. So if you're just only recruiting every so often, you probably don't need complicated technology at all. You probably just manage it manually. But once you hit, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people, then obviously that's when technology can help you. So I guess on the starting point, it's the free things. What are the free things out there? Okay, LinkedIn is free. The job sites are free. Obviously the recruiters, some fees, but helpful in terms of getting some CVs in. So those will be the starting point. And when you've got like a big volume of candidates, that's when you start thinking, okay, what can I automate? Okay, in terms of like chasing the managers, making sure that they have the meeting schedule on time. That's when you look at those systems, and some of them are built into the HR system, and some are actually are separate products, like that filtering system I mentioned. Then you have thinking besides tech. So you have this problem of trying to find candidates. And I think John kind of touched on it. It's actually your EVP. So, okay, so we need this kind of candidate, but actually realistically, are you the kind of employer that people actually would be flocking over to join? Is this realistic? So in that sense, would it actually make more sense to just like, rather than having to employ someone, could you just have them as a consultant, or, as a temporary contract? I used to work in the higher education sector, and annual, perennial complaint is like, oh, we have problems trying to recruit IT people into the organization, thinking, well, if you want them for specific sort of advanced projects, it probably doesn't make sense to have them as a permanent staff. You probably just have them as a fixed contract for a particular project. And that's one thing, as the EVP, what attracts you people to your company. And then the other thing is, okay, we've got a limited source. So putting the tech aside, looking inside our organization, who can we develop to fill in that role? They might not be able to do it now, but they perhaps might be ready in 2 or 3 years' time. Who in our organization can do that? And for small organizations, people know everybody, so you don't actually need a system to help you with that. But once you reach, 1,000 plus, you might actually find it helpful to have something like an internal talent marketplace, where you're actually looking within the organization to see who's good at what, how well do they match the specific roles, are they 80% match or 70% match? So when you have a situation where, especially for companies that are sort of project-based, where skills are constantly changing, this kind of tool like internal talent marketplace is particularly useful, because skills are always changing and you need a kind of real-time view of where people are at. So it's huge opportunities out there, but do you actually need it?
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points that you've made there as well, Hayfa. It's also kind of interesting to think that it doesn't have to be about external facing, because it could also be used internally for the succession planning, like you've just mentioned. So it's really interesting. And John, you were just going to come in with something as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when it comes to kind of advertising and sourcing candidates, it's very hard to avoid using algorithms to some degree. Somebody sent me a link to an article on the Guardian website. I opened it and an advert popped up for a partner organisation. It's a job, so it's any kind of advertising now uses some form of algorithm. And I think it's just, if you use any major website, you are using algorithms. It's just being aware of that. And that just point about taking care, because anything you put in, any preference will be amplified to a certain degree. So it's just any kind of recruitment system will have it to a certain degree. Yeah.
And just extending the conversation, because we have a question about outside of recruitment, what are your views on other uses of AI in the workplace, whether it be for task simplification, performance monitoring, scheduling, and does it need to be regulated? So an interesting thought there. Hayfa's nodding away there. Hayfa, what are your views on that?
Oh yes, we definitely need some kind of regulation. It's I liken just to borrow someone else's quote. It's like the wild west. You need to like install the roads, the traffic lights, and the safety system. So yeah, we do need some kind of regulation. And the reality is, regulation is always catching up. That's always going to be the case, because tech moves faster than regulation, and businesses move faster than regulation, but slower than the people, because they got the mobile devices at home. So yes, we do need regulation.
Yeah, Doug, have you got any thoughts on that?
Look, I'd agree. I think Hayfa's a lot more efficient than I am, but look, I'd agree. But there's a lot of value and uses to it, right? It just, like everything, it's got to be done in the right way, and I think people need to know where data is being captured, how it's being captured, what it's being used for, and I think it's the interpretation of that data as well about how it's used actually within the workplace can make a huge difference and loads of value, and can make everybody massively efficient. And when people want to talk about working a 4-day week or whatever else it might be, that's going to come from us being smarter with things like this, that mean actually we can be more productive throughout the time that we work. We can work with the level of flexibility we want. They're the wins in the workplace, but with it being unregulated, it can be used in other ways which are maybe not as beneficial. So yeah, I definitely. But as Hayfa says, catching up with it is difficult, and I think there's a big debate about how on earth do you make sure that the law and regulations within this field and all technology areas can actually be appropriate to what's going on and what's likely to go on in the future, because at the moment they just can't be. So
yeah. But it's interesting when you talk about the future, Doug, because, the way that you can use it is going to keep evolving, isn't it, with the way that we're working, and opening more and more possibilities to that increased flexibility and being smarter and being more productive. So, yeah, this is going to keep evolving all of the time, isn't it? John, do you want to say something as well?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I think it's possibly worth keeping an eye on what's going to come down the road. I looked at some kind of case studies, and there's an interesting one somewhere in the States where they've used AI to kind of monitor people's email, and they've been able to spot harassers in the workplace because of patterns of language and patterns of behavior. And actually, does the pressure come on to, in terms of discharging our duty of care as an employer, but then the kind of ethics of monitoring people's use of email to a certain point, and what does that do to the trust of employers in the employer? And that's something we've always got. HR management's a social activity at the end of the day, and we've got to make sure we're very, very careful about what we do automate, and the power of these things to, and just because something picks up a pattern, is it actually accurate, or is it just a set of crude decisions that have been automated that kind of flags an alarm bell? And so it's, even if we can automate some things, how we then react to it we've got to have control over, and we've got to kind of pay attention to. Just because we can automate something doesn't mean we allow other people to make decisions for us. We've still got to think about what we do with the information that's generated. But augmentation, I think, is going to be the future for a lot of tasks more than automation, especially in the kind of highly skilled tasks that are needed. And so I think that becomes a bit less problematic. But there's a massive amount of potential, but it's not there yet. I'd rather wait until it was perfected and regulated and had some kind of history in place before using it myself.
Yeah, I've just posted a link on the government's AI roadmap. So, like you mentioned about, is AI trustworthy? So the government is looking at ways to make AI more trustworthy, and at the same time grow the market for AI, to audit trustworthy AI as well. So, that includes having this kind of like badge saying it's a safe AI to use. And one of the other proposals is that for employers to show that the AI is fair and safe to use before, and to continue to monitor that. So that now we're kind of doing it voluntarily, but in the future it might be actually a requirement that employers that are using AI for risky purposes, where where it's life-changing, like who gets fired, for example, they need to demonstrate that it's fair and consistent and all that.
It's definitely going to be something that's going to help to continue to elevate good employment practice as well, isn't it, going forward? And from the sound as well, from what you've all been saying, it will change the feel and the way that we work and how a workplace can operate going forward. Won't it's kind of like looking into the future, isn't it? Something you've seen on a film ages ago.
It will do. I think the other angle we've got to think about from the recruitment thing is how it does change this candidate journey as well, because how do you access these roles? How do you actually work through these systems and processes? You've got one end. I don't know, have you seen it? There was on BBC iPlayer the other week. There's a Computer Says No, it was called, a program that was on there, and they were talking about, I think they were doing something at Liverpool University. They had a bunch of CVs, and they were working through actually, okay, if you're a graduate, what are the keywords you need to put into your CV to make it through the first sift on some basic algorithms. And then they did a sneaky thing at the end where they then wrote, I can't remember what it was that they thought these algorithms would pick up, but they wrote in white text at the bottom of the CV on a white page all those words they knew the algorithm would pick up, with a view that actually the CV would make it through that first stage a little bit better. So you're getting people trying to beat that system. Yeah. And then you've also got people that might not want to engage with the system if, for example, it's a video interview as the first stage that might be coming through. So employers have to think about what they're doing. But I think from people that are looking for roles, wanting to access roles, we've got to think very, very carefully about what that journey needs to look like too, and how we need to evolve that scenario.
How do you kind of educate and inform prospective job hunters about this new way of recruiting going forward, so that they can put the best self forward, so that they know how the process will work? Are there things that can be done to make people aware of it and to prepare them better for when they're applying for roles?
I think there can be. I think normally when we're doing it, we'd be on behalf of an employer, and therefore we'd have a good understanding of what their process might be. So we might be working with a customer, and they might say, okay, we're going to do our first round process where we've got 5 recorded questions essentially, and you're going to log on, someone's going to ask you that question, and you're going to answer it. I guess there are techniques, but there's they're just evolution of technique. So if we were talking to somebody and saying, look, if you were going for a face-to-face interview as a competency-based interview, you need to swat up on the STAR technique because this is how you need to answer that question. It's evolving that through to say, okay, this would be my advice if you're then doing something from a video interview, or this would be my advice if this is what you're going to encounter. But we're probably in the privileged position that we'd have found that out. I think if you're applying to somebody directly and you weren't necessarily au fait with either what was behind their system or involved in it, it would be harder to guess.
Yeah. And John, thinking about, your areas of work where you've got people that perhaps are a bit, more distant from the labour market at times, what kinds of things could an employer do to help to prepare candidates that they are ultimately trying to attract if they're trying to add that diversity to the workforce?
I think the practices that you need to adopt aren't just related to IT. They're just good practice at the end of the day. Yeah. If you're using interviews, share those interviews in advance so people can prepare an answer, rather than otherwise you just get people who can improvise on the spot, and that might be great for some jobs, but not for every one of them. And it's just just put yourself in the candidate's shoes, that kind of journey. I was just speaking to a couple of the chief execs of voluntary organisations the other day, and they were talking about, we like to have candidates at senior management level interviewed by some of our staff, and we can do this, we could, and it's like, well, how does the candidate feel coming into that situation about sharing something that they might share confidentially with an interview panel with staff? And I think it's thinking about some of those processes, about what will you do that makes it more uncomfortable for somebody to give you an answer, and therefore are you getting a good performance out of them, say for a pre-recorded interview. Some people might like a pre-recorded interview because there's no pressure of seeing somebody face to face and eye to eye. Some people might just freeze up because they're just not comfortable on camera. And I think it's just having that kind of empathy for, we're going to put human beings through this process. How would I react? How would people I know react? And therefore, how can we design a process that kind of maximize the better reactions and minimizes the worst ones, and give feedback where possible, I think is always a key element to that. Yeah.
And giving people those options in terms of what might work best for them through that process too. Yeah. Hayfa, did you want to say something on that as well?
No, I think John said it really well.
Yeah. Brilliant. I'm just going to check for any more questions because I'm conscious that we are nearing the end of our period. I think we've covered most of them now. Are there any, before we finish, because we're due to finish in 5 minutes, are there any final things or points that you'd want to make to our audience before we sign off? Any good tips for them before we go? John, have you got anything you want to say to anybody who's looking at all of this area?
Don't panic. It's people can always worry about that kind of sense of feeling of missing out. I think it's one of the most powerful motivating factors in human behaviour. I don't think that somebody's got a better approach. I think just that point of experimenting a bit, trying a bit, but don't leave you exposed to something that's just don't go the whole hog in one go. Don't feel as though you're missing out. Other people are struggling to recruit at the moment as well, and AI and automated processes aren't always the answer.
Yeah, it's about keeping an open mind, isn't it, about what works for you as well, isn't it? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, we're almost at the end then, so I'm going to start wrapping up then, unless anybody, I'm just seeing if anybody's got any final questions before we go. But we haven't. So I would just want to thank our panel. It's been really interesting. Some of the comments that we've had in the chat, people have found it interesting and useful. So thank you for being with us this afternoon, and hope you have a good rest of the week. Okay, and thank you to Doug, Hayfa and John for contributing to this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.